In April 1912, the greatest ship in the world, the RMS Titanic, sank on its maiden voyage from Britain to America. 100 years on, the story still resonates.
Iceberg, get ahead, sir!
The sinking of the Titanic was the greatest disaster of the age. From the moment it sank, a series of powerful myths grew up around the ship. Perhaps the most pervasive is that of the band bravely playing on as the ship sank.
This is the story of the musicians who played on the Titanic. 8 men who'd never played in a band together, but whose names would be forever linked in death. The legendary band who played on.
But who were these men? And why did they do it? The early 20th century was a golden age of scientific and engineering advancement. The Titanic, the pride of the White Star Line, was the jewel in the crown. It was the biggest, most luxurious ship in the world, and famously, it was said to be unsinkable. At the time, there was a huge rise in emigration to America, and shipping lines like Cunard and White Star were cashing in.
Cunard's motto was safety, speed and luxury. White Star's, ironically, was safety and luxury. They didn't go in for the blue riband of the Atlantic or anything like that.
Cunard had the 2 record breakers, Lusitania and Mauritania. View those as the Concorde of the day. So if you wanted to get to the States fast, you'd travel by Cunard, not by White Star. But White Star introduced a whole higher level of luxury, if you will. They go for the 2 complete opposite ends of the travelling public spectrum. They go for the absolute top 2% cream of society, and they go for the complete bottom end steerage class.
Whether you went for luxury or speed, high-quality music was an important part of the transatlantic experience. And of course, it had to be played live. The 8 musicians on the Titanic were the crème de la crème, hand-picked for their talent, sound character and savoir-faire.
On the chilly sunny morning of Wednesday, April 10th, 1912, the 8 musicians hauled their instrument cases along this pier through crowds of second and third class passengers to where the Titanic stood. Just here, at berths 43 and 44 at the White Star dock.
Although they're known as the band, the 8 musicians actually played as 2 separate groups, a quintet and a trio. The trio was made up of French cellist Roger Bricout, Belgian violinist George Crins and multi-instrumentalist Theo Brayley from London. They played outside the first-class restaurant to add a touch of continental sophistication. The quintet was led by violinist and bandmaster Wallace Hartley. He was joined by cellist Wes Woodward, Percy Taylor on piano and cello, violinist Jock Hume and double bass player Fred Clark. They were all young men. The oldest was just 33, and at least one of them is known to have been apprehensive about the Titanic job.
A few days before he was due to leave for Southampton and join the Titanic, Fred Clark went for a drink with a few of his musician pals. They said he seemed a little morose. Fred had never been at sea before, and he was dreading it. But this was no ordinary ship, and he said, "This is too good a gig to turn down." Even so, he told his friends,
"You know, I've kept away from it so long, it would be just my luck to go down with the ship." For jobbing musicians, playing on a ship was a good gig. They got to see the world at a time when few people could travel abroad, and they could easily double their earnings in tips from wealthy passengers. Dancing was not a feature of life on board Titanic, and there was no ballroom, but music accompanied just about every daily activity. As band leader, Wallace Hartley had to make sure the musicians remained inconspicuous while keeping every performance sharp and fresh, whether accompanying afternoon tea or winding down the evening with soothing strings. Wallace Hartley was born and raised in the Lancashire mill town of Colne. He was the perfect choice as bandleader. An outstanding musician, he was also a devout Methodist and a man of sound temperament. There's now a permanent museum in Colne dedicated to the Titanic and the town's most famous son. Wallace was engaged to be married and was planning to make the Titanic his last sea voyage, a final big payday before his wedding. This recently discovered photograph is the only known image of Wallace's fiancée, Maria Robinson, and has never been seen in public before.
What kind of man do you think Wallace was?
Wallace Hartley was a family man. He was very devoted to his parents. They were very, very close. His father was a devout Methodist, as they all were. They started they're one of the original founders of Bethel Independent Chapel. The family went back generations here. They were very well respected in musical circles and family circles here.
He came across as a very sort of dignified, very moral person, a very friendly person. I mean, a lot of people talked about him as someone that they would look up to. I mean, even before he was, even before he'd gone onto the ships.
He wasn't going to go on the Titanic. He literally came off the Mauritania on the 9th of April, went to the agency to pick up his pay, and they said, we'll give you a little bit extra if you go straight down to Southampton and join the Titanic, which unfortunately for him is what he did.
On board Titanic, at the end of the first day at sea, Wallace Hartley wrote what would be his last letter home to his family.
Just a line to say we've got away all right. It's been a bit of a rush, but I'm getting a little settled. This is a fine ship and there ought to be plenty of money around. We've a fine band and the boys seem nice. I miss coming home very much and it would have been nice to see you all, if only for an hour or two, but I couldn't have managed it. She'll probably arrive home on the Sunday morning. All love, Wallace.
The musicians had been hired by the Black Brothers Agency, who had recently struck a deal making them the sole suppliers of on-board entertainment to the shipping lines. It was a great deal for everyone except the musicians.
This agency got a monopoly on all the transatlantic liners, on the entertainment on these liners. You know, they would agree with the shipping line, we will supply you with 5 musicians or 8 musicians at this price. So they would take the money and then they would give a proportion of that, you know, maybe 50% to the musicians. And it meant a drop in the actual wages of the musicians.
And Nigel, what would the professional life of a musician have been like working on the Titanic?
They would have been worked hard. The day would be long, anything up to 10, 12 hours, sometimes longer. And they would play at different locations. Because, of course, you had this wonderful grand staircase that went up 5 decks. When the orchestra was positioned there, all the music would literally float up and down this grand staircase. You'd just have this fantastic sound. It would sound quite eerie. Passengers would be given a little book with at least 300 different songs that they had to know. And the passengers would just call out, oh, play me number 26 or whatever. And they would have to know what that song related to.
To be able to just choose a number at will and play it, and all of them to know it, is quite remarkable.
And that's where the phrase playing a number comes from.
The life of the Edwardian musician was tough. I mean, in a very simple physical sense, they were working 12, 13 hours a day. They had to learn up to 350 songs. I mean, that is really mind-blowing. I mean, if my band can learn 35 songs that we can rotate on tour, that is some stretch of our powers of remembering. And the fact that, you know, when I think about myself in a band, you know, it's all about, are people looking at me, what am I doing, are people digging what I'm doing? They were completely ignored. They'd be playing in the corner of the bar of a ship or a hotel, and the only time they get any attention is if they did something wrong and they get sacked.
But the musicians on the Titanic still considered themselves lucky. They were on the biggest, most luxurious liner in the world, plying their trade to an appreciative audience including some of the world's wealthiest people. As the Titanic headed into the Atlantic, the sea was calm, the weather was fine, and the tips were good. The musicians had settled into a daily routine. Everything seemed right with the world. Sunday, April 14th began as another unremarkable day for the musicians on the Titanic. They played at Sunday service, at luncheon and tea, before giving their final evening performance. They knocked off around 11 p.m. It was a moonless night, no wind and a flat, calm sea. The temperature had been dropping all day. Ships ahead of Titanic were reporting heavy ice.
At just before 11:40, high in the crow's nest, lookout Frederick Fleet made out a looming object in the bitter dark. He rang the signal bell 3 times and phoned a message through to the bridge. Iceberg straight ahead.
Order starboard, sir.
The starboard side took the grinding impact and a shudder went through the ship. Ice scattered the starboard decks, but few people thought it was serious. One man used a shard of ice to cool his nightcap. Other passengers played football with lumps of ice. Beneath their feet, water was surging in at a rate of 400 tons a minute. Titanic's builder, Thomas Andrews, made a rapid inspection and gave his report to Captain Smith.
She's going to sink, Captain.
Nothing could be done. The Titanic would sink within hours. The radio room sent out the first distress signals, but the nearest ship was 4 hours away. By then, it would be too late. Captain Smith ordered the lifeboats to be readied, knowing there were only enough for half those on board. Corridors and stairways filled with confused and anxious faces. Surely things couldn't be that serious. Not on the Titanic.
Everybody knows this ship can't sink.
Eyewitnesses reported seeing the musicians running below deck to get their instruments. One person remembered some of the crew laughing at them.
The crew must have thought the musicians were anxious to save their instruments. They didn't realise they were preparing to play.
At 12:15, the 8 men who'd never played together before assembled in the first-class lounge and started playing cheerful ragtime tunes, which were all the rage.
They clearly did it to make people feel like everything's normal. Like, you know, if you're on a plane and there's a bit of turbulence, if the captain comes on and he sounds fairly jolly, you think, oh, not too much to worry about. And I think they were trying to have that sort of effect.
Would they have been ordered to play?
No, they did it entirely voluntarily. Nobody ordered them. They just literally got together and they played.
As the situation became more serious, Wallace Hartley and his men put on their life jackets and moved on deck, outside the first-class entrance. They continued to play cheery ragtime music.
There was this thought process going on where it'll settle and then stop. For that sort of hour and a half, hour and 3/4, most people, the orchestra included, would have been labouring under that illusion, if you will. And it's only probably when you get to the point where the bridge at the front of the ship and all that area of the deck around the number 1 funnel is slipping under and it's getting awash, that it suddenly dawns on people that, well, sorry, no, this vessel is not going to settle and then stop sinking. This is going all the way to the bottom.
The first lifeboats were lowered half empty, but the remaining boats were overcrowded. Wives and husbands parted, children kissed their fathers goodbye, and the band played on.
Women and children first!
You would have had very brave people who just stood back, and you would have had people who would have panicked and tried to get into the boats.
Quickly! This way!
At 2:05 a.m., with many passengers still on board, the last lifeboat was lowered.
It's the end, boys. We've done our duty. We can go now.
All the musicians were raised as churchgoers, and when the situation became grave, many of the survivors reported hearing the band play hymns. Wallace held strong views on music as a force for good. And once when he was serving on another ship, he was asked by a journalist how he thought he'd cope if he ever found himself in a disaster at sea.
I've always felt that when men are called upon to face death suddenly, music's far more effective in cheering them on than all the firearms in creation. Should an accident befall my ship, I know that every one of the men would stick with me and play until the waters engulfed us.
The vessel gets to a point where she's tilting so much, she's listing, you would have trouble standing on the deck. And certainly for, someone with a cello or a violin or something like that, just physically standing up would have been difficult. To stand there and play an instrument as well would have been virtually impossible.
At some point during the last 10 minutes, Wallace Hartley and his fellow bandsmen made a jump for it, just before the ship made its final dive.
It would have been absolutely horrendous. She split in half, the bow section went straight down and hit the seabed at about 40 miles an hour.
It's not going down like a fairy tale, this ship. Things are crashing, things are falling on you, and it's horrific.
One guy described it as like a carrot breaking off. It went down and then it snapped back. And the sound was apparently absolutely horrific. Because, if you think of it, everything that was kind of anchored inside it, like all the huge boilers and everything that was fixed down, suddenly tore free of their moorings and just fell right through the ship. So it's that incredible noise that nobody had ever heard before.
The after section went up literally on end, almost perpendicular, and it stayed there for just a few minutes. It was filled with air. Then as the air came out and the water replaced it, it just went straight under. There was no suction, and one of the particular characters, one of the bakers, Mr. Jolkin, he swam off the end of the Titanic. He had his arm round the flagstaff, and he literally swam off without even getting his head wet.
1,500 men, women and children were now thrashing about in the water. Those watching from the lifeboats paid a terrible price for surviving. The screams of the dying would haunt them for the rest of their lives.
Their cries came to us in full volume along the level sea, as though only a few yards away, carrying with them every possible emotion of human fear, despair, agony, fierce resentment, and blind anger, mingled, I'm certain of this, with notes of infinite surprise, as though each one was saying, "How is it possible that this awful thing is happening to me?"
A lot of people didn't drown on the Titanic. The main reason for their death was actually hypothermia, because the life expectancy was only 4 to 5 minutes because of the intense cold. But none of the musicians got into any of the lifeboats.
But the 8 musicians, through their brave and selfless actions, were about to be reborn as heroes.
A little over 700 half-frozen survivors of the Titanic were rescued by the Cunard liner Carpathia. It took 3 days to get them to New York. In the meantime, the world was desperate for news.
The Titanic disaster was the Twin Tower event of its day. It seriously had that amount of impact on the world.
It questioned our ability to progress. It seemed to ram it home that it wasn't limitless, because this great, apparently unsinkable ship and just a lump of ice, bang, the whole thing's gone. I think it really brought people up with a start.
Starved of facts, competing newspapers began concocting lurid fantasies. One early report said that all passengers and crew had been saved. Another said the damaged Titanic itself was being towed into New York.
They made up all kinds of stories about some of the people on the ship. Captain Smith was seen swimming away with a baby in his arms. Some of the people that they photographed weren't even on the Titanic. They were just people that they got off the street, stood in front of a studio with a backdrop and photographed them and said these people were on the Titanic. They made it all up. Nothing new there, is there?
But there was news to be had if you were in the right place. Journalist Carlos Hurd happened to be on board the Carpathia en route to a Mediterranean holiday when he found himself in the middle of the scoop of a lifetime. He was under strict orders not to speak to the traumatized survivors, but he found them only too willing to talk and began writing his report. A crowd of over 40,000 met the Carpathia in New York. Reporters crammed into hired tugs, coming up alongside and shouting questions. Carlos Hurd wrapped his copy in a waterproof bag and threw it to a waiting tug. His report hit the newsstands later the same night. It said that the 8 musicians of the ship's band were the heroes of the day, staying on board as the ship sank and playing the hymn Nearer My God to Thee at the very end.
The band were the instant heroes of the time, especially as none of them survived.
I've been in a band most of my life, and I've had some pretty hairy experiences. I've nearly been electrocuted, I've fallen off stage a few times and had some bottles thrown at me. And the show must always go on. And what's really intrigued me is what on earth was going through the heads of these young fellas as they played on, in the full knowledge that they were going to die.
The brave and selfless actions of the musicians provided a symbol of hope in the face of unimaginable horror. The world now demanded to know more about these men. Reporters started digging into their backgrounds, searching for clues that might explain the bravery of their actions. And that's what I'm about to do too.
Well, here we are in London, Soho, an area for various reasons I know very well indeed. But a good few years ago, a very close friend of mine told me about an amazing memorial to the band members that went down on the Titanic, but he couldn't remember where it was. Well, I've just discovered it's right here, in what was, until a few years ago, the offices of the Musicians' Union.
And it's here that I've arranged to meet a descendant of one of the band members.
So Yvonne, what's your connection to the band on the Titanic?
Well, I'm the great niece of John Law Hume, first violinist on Titanic. My grandfather was his younger brother.
How did he end up being in the band on the Titanic?
He was one of the best, and when they got the musicians together for Titanic, they insisted on the best they could find. And obviously, John being such a good violinist from the age of 5, he was straight in there, yes, and he jumped at the opportunity. Despite his stepmother having nightmares and trying to say, please don't go on there, she had this vision that something would happen. He ignored that because he wanted the adventure, and off he went.
And had he played on boats before?
Yes, he had. Oh, at least 5 others, the Megantic, the California, the Olympic and the Carmania. Here's a photograph of John on the Carmania.
A fantastic photograph.
Yes,
yeah.
Now this was the last photograph known that was taken of John here. Now he is actually the bandmaster, although he's only at the age of 21, which I'm rather proud of. But this is a lovely photograph. I love the cap tilted, typical of a 21-year-old. And yes, this was the ship that he went on just before Titanic. So it's nice to have that more recent photograph.
Fabulous. I mean, yeah, it could be an album cover for the Beatles.
That's right, yes.
And do you have any idea what sort of man John was?
Oh yes, he was a very fun-loving character, always out to play jokes, but not in a nasty way, a very sort of loving chap. When he was playing on, not on Titanic, one of the other ships, a lady came up to him and said, oh, could you play a certain piece of music? And he winked to the other band members and said, yes, of course I can. Well, it was a rather complicated piece of music, and they played a different piece of music. Unbeknown to the woman, she came up and gracefully thanked them at the end. And that was John's sense of humour. It's lovely reading about him to know that he was so happy in what he was doing.
There are an amazing number of stories of people having premonitions of disaster before boarding the Titanic, and that applies to another of the musicians, Theo Brayley.
So surely you were related to one of the members of the band on the Titanic?
It was my grandmother's brother. So I took the name Brayley because when I got divorced, I didn't want to take my maiden name, and I thought, I like the name Brayley, and I've always felt kind of quite fond of Theo, so I took his name. The family didn't want him to be on the boats, but he did go and see my grandmother, his sister, and the story goes, and my mother told me this, that he paced up and down on the carpet and he said, I feel I'm going to drown.
No.
This is the story. So she said, well, don't go. I don't want you to go. You know, stop. And he said, no, he said, musicians always die young. And that is the family story.
Blimey.
I know, it makes you kind of go a bit cold, doesn't it? These are kind of my favourites, because these are before, obviously, when he was a young man, he must have come back home. There he is, looking rather solemn.
Rather handsome chap, eh?
I think he had a lovely face.
And do you feel a genuine connection to him? I mean, I know it's all gone into sort of mythology, but you are genuinely related to him, and you feel that, yeah.
I'm very, very fond of him. His life was, well, it's always tragic to hear of anybody's life cut that short. And he was obviously a very talented chap, and he's got a very nice face, kind of very kind face. And also because he was cut down like that. Obviously, my other relatives of that age group, I knew them, they were elderly people, and they died. And somehow he's like this missing person. And yeah, I've got kind of cards that he sent to my grandmother. They were very close, my grandmother and he. Darling Grandpa and Grandma, I'm still plodding along, but I don't feel quite so well. I feel rather weary of it. I have had a bad time with ptomaine poisoning, but I'm quite well now. He talked a lot about health. I hope you're all well. I shall be very glad to see you again. So you get the feeling that he probably was quite a home lover, really. He says here, just landed in Gibraltar. The weather is most glorious. You have no idea how beautiful it is. I was very sick in the Bay of Biscay. It's wonderful, isn't it?
Well, and I suppose also, you know, in those days before modern medicine, you know, your health was a very important factor.
Of course it was. Of course, naturally. It would have been.
Especially being in all those funny foreign places, eh?
Well, yes, absolutely. But I think the story is, and I think this is quite likely, that he'd actually gone on to earn some money. But also I was always told that he'd gone because he was a composer as well as a musician, and he wanted really to compose, and that he felt that if he went on the ships he'd meet people. No, that doesn't actually add up to me, but that was what the story was I was told.
Theo Brayley's music hasn't been heard in public since the Titanic sank. But this is it. Well, a jolly little piece, isn't it?
It is a jolly little piece, yes. It's called Scherzo, which is Italian for joke, but it's got a very strange dedication to my brother in adversity. And in the trio, it gets really quite dark. A little bit sad there. So there's a lot of difference in mood between the opening and the trio.
Yeah. He's obviously a man of many moods. Yes, we've seen the transition from joy to really quite sad.
Yeah.
And what do you think of the music? I mean, would you think that's the kind of music he would have been playing around the time that he was?
Oh, I'm sure. Yes, it's typical of the sort of upbringing he would have had within music, which would have been the Western European classical tradition of Beethoven and so forth. So Edwardian music is Elgar, I suppose. So it's the same sort of mood with a little bit of sentiment in it. Melodic and tuneful.
And slightly wistful.
Yeah.
Music featured prominently in all the early reports of the disaster, and the myth of the band began to grow. Eyewitnesses said that the final song they played was the hymn, Nearer My God to Thee, and this iconic image gripped the public imagination. But a controversy was about to arise which would cast doubt on the story and threaten to undermine the heroic myth. The first reports of the Titanic disaster stated that the final song the band played as the ship sank was the hymn Nearer My God to Thee. This iconic image gripped the imagination of the Edwardian public. There was just one problem. Nearer My God to Thee is played to different tunes in Britain and America. Yet both British and American survivors said they heard it.
Probably they would have done it to this tune. Which is called Proprio Deo, and it's by Arthur Sullivan of Gilbert and Sullivan fame. The Americans used to sing to this tune. Which is called Horbury. And the one that's used in the film is called Bethany. Which for some reason is probably the best known for it, but if you look through hymn books, there's very few hymn books actually use that tune. So...
The mysteries within mysteries.
Mysteries within an enigma,
That's
yes.
right.
Band leader Wallace Hartley called the tunes, so which version of the hymn would he have known?
It was actually from the Independent Methodists. So I looked at their hymn book, which has Nearer My God to Thee in it, but when it gives the tunes that you can play it to, it actually has the tune that the Americans use, as well as the tune that the Methodists use in Britain. So as his father was the guy who introduced Nearer My God to the church in Col, and as he was the choir master, I would assume that Wallace Hartley was familiar with these optional tunes.
Then things got really complicated. Titanic's wireless operator, Harold Bride, was one of the last to leave the ship. In an interview with the New York Times, he said the band had been playing something completely different at the end.
Harold Bride, he actually threw the cat amongst the pigeons and said, "I'm sorry, but it wasn't Nearer My God to Thee, the last tune. It was a songe de ton." But he didn't say songe de ton, he said autumn. So it threw it again into the public arena. Hang on, is it the Episcopalian hymn, Autumn, or Guide Me Thou Great Jehovah? Was it that? What was he referring to?
Autumn Song was a popular hit of the day. We know the band had been playing jaunty tunes to cheer people up, so Bride may have been right about Autumn. But it was too late. The Edwardian public had already decided that Nearer My God to Thee was the perfect soundtrack to the final scene of the disaster. And the press were only too willing to spin the story.
I think at that point, I think people wanted it to be Nearer My God to Thee because it was a godly society, and people just jumped at the chance that they wanted to create this image or this persona of people going to meet their maker when they died. And so it fitted to the Edwardian society beautifully.
There are many conflicting accounts as to exactly what happened that night. A few passengers even suggested the band didn't even play at all and called such stories damned lies. But to judge one eyewitness account against another is pointless. We'll never know exactly what happened and when, and really, we don't need to.
An overwhelming body of evidence points to the fact that the musicians stayed on board and kept playing as the ship sank, putting the comfort and well-being of the passengers before their own personal safety. To a world traumatised by the loss of the unsinkable ship, they symbolised what was noblest and most enduring about the human spirit. Within weeks of the disaster, a memorabilia industry had grown up telling and retelling the story.
If they didn't have a picture of the Titanic, they just made it up. And they used anything, any four-funnel ship. It didn't matter whether it was the Mauretania, the Lusitania, a warship with four funnels. The only thing you can compare it to today, I suppose, is when Princess Diana died and all that kind of memorabilia was put out. It's exactly the same with Titanic.
In that terrible shipwreck that shocked the world, the greatest disaster yet known, where men of great wealth who boldly faced death to help others reach home sweet home. Yeah, so it was very quickly romanticised. And who was writing these kind of songs?
Anybody who could actually write music or write the lyrics.
Just like any kind of form of popular music, it was a subject that was going to attract the interest of the public.
Yes. And they had to have sheet music because not that many people had gramophones. These would cost you around about 6 months, 2.5p. People could afford that, and because so many people played the piano in those days, whether you're in a pub or whether you're in your home, this is what people related to.
The musicians, in a way, symbolised the fact that things weren't as bad as they seemed, because I was reading a lot of newspaper coverage prior to that, and there was this kind of fear that men were becoming a bit soft. They weren't like their parents or their grandparents. And because these guys were brave and they carried on playing as the ship was going down, I think people thought, yeah, there is still some courage there, because this random group of 8 people who, as far as we know, were not qualified to do such a thing, actually acted incredibly bravely at the moment of disaster.
The White Star Line's £1 million insurance claim for the loss of the Titanic was settled immediately. But for the families of the musicians, there was to be a nasty shock. Their new contract with the Black Brothers agency was about to come back and haunt them.
Technically, they were employees of this agency, not of the White Star Line, which you think, well, what does that matter? But in the end, it mattered quite a lot, because when it came to compensation, they weren't covered by the White Star's insurance, and they weren't covered by the Workmen's Compensation Act. So basically, naturally, they weren't due anything.
To make matters worse, the Black Brothers also demanded compensation from the family of violinist Jock Hume, who didn't have time to pay for his new uniform before joining the Titanic.
What upset me quite a lot is they sent a bill for John's uniform to my great-grandfather, Andrew, which caused him extreme distress because his body hadn't even been recovered by then.
So they were sending a bill for a uniform for a man that hadn't even been found yet?
Yes, that's right.
The steamer Mackie Bennett left Nova Scotia with the harrowing task of recovering bodies. After 13 days, 306 bodies had been found, including 3 of the musicians, Fred Clark, Jock Hume and Wallace Hartley. They were found close together, so they probably stayed with each other till the end. Fred and Jock were buried in Nova Scotia. The Titanic memorabilia industry continues to flourish. The fascination around the myth of the band endures. And in March 2011, an artifact was discovered which gave the story a dramatic new twist. It's claimed that the violin played by band leader Wallace Hartley on board the Titanic has been found.
And auctioneers down in Bath, who deal with a lot of Titanic memorabilia, had this violin brought to them, which was allegedly the property of Maria Robinson, who was Wallace Hartley's fiancée at the time of the sinking, and which had an engraving on it saying, to Wallace on the occasion of our engagement. And there was a diary with it, Maria Robinson's diary, supposedly, and she had written in there a draft of a letter to the authorities in Nova Scotia, and it mentioned the name of the person that she was writing to, saying thanks for the return of the violin. And I did check the name of the person that this was addressed to, and it was an actual person that worked at the Nova Scotia authorities at the time.
The violin's now in the hands of a specialist auction house, undergoing forensic tests to see whether it's genuine or a fake.
I don't have any problem with it being a Wallace Hartley violin. Everything looks right for it, hallmarks on the silver and things like that. But the sheer practicalities of it being the Wallace Hartley violin are just way, way, way too big. The evidence stacks up against it so far from my perspective that you can't prove it.
And where do you differ on this, Darren?
I'm a violinist and I'm very, very attached to my violin. And if my house was burning, I'd run in and get my violin. Why would he leave his violin there? He must have had at some point time to put it away and strap it to himself. I think after the disaster, they didn't think ahead to how we would be researching and finding these things out. I think it was probably placed somewhere.
Wallace Hartley's violin that he was playing on the deck of the Titanic as the ship is sinking is not something that's just going to disappear into Granny's attic for a century.
If it's genuine, it's estimated the violin could fetch more than £1 million at auction. But is it the real thing or a fake? We'll just have to wait and see.
Wallace Hartley's body was not to rest with his friends Fred and Jock in Nova Scotia. Instead, it was embalmed and sent home to England. Wallace's father came to Liverpool to face the grim task of identifying his son. Wallace's body was then taken by horse-drawn hearse the 60 miles from Liverpool to his hometown of Cologne.
They put on an impressive funeral for him because they felt they needed to do that. They owed it to him, really. He was like their local hero. So much so that they say up to 40,000 people lined the streets. Now, mills and shops and businesses would all shut for the half day and draw the blinds in mark of respect. So imagine it, absolutely full of people. You couldn't move. The mounted police all had to come in and control the crowds.
Professional musicians from all over Britain had travelled to Cologne to pay their last respects to a brother who brought honour to their profession.
One of the black brothers from the agency who contracted these musicians out, he's actually listed as attending Wallace Hartley's funeral. So I wonder how they felt about that, you know.
The crowds followed the coffin all the way to the cemetery. As Wallace's body was lowered into the grave, the mourners sang, "Nearer, my God, to Thee."
Here he is, Wallace Henry Hartley. Poor chap. The beloved son of Albion and Elizabeth, formerly of Cologne, who lost his life in the SS Titanic disaster, April the 15th, 1912, aged 33 years. Nearer, my God, to Thee. Indeed. So that's it. Poor old Wallace Hartley, who literally gave his life for music.
In the weeks and months to come, more memorials were erected to honour the musicians than any other victims of the Titanic. Nearer, my God, to Thee rang out from countless remembrance services and benefit concerts. At the Royal Albert Hall, 500 musicians, the largest orchestra ever assembled, was conducted by Sir Edward Elgar, Thomas Beecham and Sir Henry Wood. The final song played was Nearer, my God, to Thee. The musicians bravely played their part in what was the worst peacetime disaster in history. Had they survived, it's likely death would soon have found them in some flooded crater beside the Somme, and their names would have been carved into a different kind of monument. But in the 2 years between the sinking and the outbreak of the First World War, the musicians of the Titanic became more than just men.
On a ship named after Greek deities, they had followed the journey of the hero. They had died and were reborn. They had become mythic.
A priceless watercolour and a friend's future at stake this morning. Lovejoy to the rescue at 10 on yesterday, after our experts get the royal seal of approval in Lake Bala. The Antiques Roadshow is next.